This works. Testing. Can you hear me? Oh, good. Okay, good. Well, welcome to Sunday Forum. I am Jane Cole. I'm on the committee of the forum, and just a pleasure to have you here. Our speaker has agreed he will handle questions, I think, as we go. Is that true? As we go? At the end. But we want to be sure you're on a mic because we have people on Zoom or whatever we're using now to be able to hear their questions. So we'll pass a mic or hand you a mic, whatever. I would like to give a shout out to one of our Plymouth members who is a treasure here. Bryce Hamilton was one of the organizers of the original Earth Day, April 22nd, 1970. And I think I'm just so proud of him for that. Wow. Yeah, that is just amazing. Well, now I am going to turn it over to Jim Lenfesti, and he is going to introduce our speaker.
Good morning, everybody. I had a great day yesterday Zooming the Mayflower Congregational Church Earth Day services, and it was just a marvel if some of you heard that. And one of the things that was going on there, which is right, is a lot of organizations are taking credit for the 100% solar bill that was passed very early in this session by the Democratic-led legislature here. Isaiah Project's taking credit. Everyone, Interfaith Power and Light is taking credit. We're taking credit. We all deserve credit, but no one deserves credit more than this guy. No one. So 30 years ago, Mike Noble was just a kid wandering around, not knowing what to do, except he noticed something that many didn't notice, that energy was fundamental to our understanding of how the world works, how the world actually works. And we had been through the Arab oil embargo, and suddenly, boom, we need to pay attention to efficiency. And then, of course, the news starts to break about the calamity known as climate change, which really begins in about 85. And 88 for sure, when Dr. James Hansen testified before Congress, we can see the fingerprints of human activity on the climate. Mike, 30 years ago, unlike most of us, said, I'm going to do something about it. And he started a small little organization called Minnesotans for an Energy Efficient Economy. It was just him for about 5 years, I think, maybe just him. I don't know. Today, staff of 30, and they are in every decision in our region about what has to do with energy. And they're in the nitty gritty. Some of us are raising cane, and some of us are raising signs, and some of us are praying. He's in the nitty gritty and every detail, including the Public Utilities Commission. And among the marvelous things that he's brought us along the way, they saw the I still want to call it ME3, now Fresh Energy. Yeah, I know that was a very long time ago. They saw the community solar bill that pioneered in Colorado, rewrote it much better for Minnesota. He said it's being rewritten again, even better. And you all know, and you should be proud, that this building you're in right now is 100% solar, but that's because of that amazing bill that we have, which most states don't have, and all wish they did. Mike, come on up and tell us the story of your 30 years at Fresh Energy.
Actually timing myself today. So people who know me well know I don't usually come with a formal talk, but I've given this talk a few times. I call it A Climate Life. For 3 decades now, Fresh Energy has been immersed in the climate science, in the policy, in action. We're working as advocates to decarbonize our economy here in the North. So we work to get the carbon emissions out of our electricity supply, and then we work to run everything we possibly can on clean electricity. So my purpose in talking here today is that I want to share some reflections about my climate life, but more than that, I want to talk about our current moment in history. And I hope to make the case that there's going to be more momentum on climate solutions in the next 4 years than there has been in the past 40 years. That's my thesis. So I personally have worked on this subject for 30 years to rewire the climate, rewire the energy systems here in Minnesota, in the North, in the Midwest. And now in 2023, I'm rewiring my own life. And I'm moving on from Fresh Energy on May 24. And we will be announcing a fabulous and dynamic new leader who will take this work to the next level. We're going to announce it in just a few days. But not here today. Not here today. So since this founding in 1990, Fresh Energy has had deep engagement in so many aspects of public policy, the decisions that drive both technology and finance and opportunity that created this clean energy revolution that's unfolding right now today. And I helped to organize the organization in 1990, but I didn't come work there for 5 years. I was a volunteer for 5 years. And when I came to work there in 1995, I was one of the first 2 employees. And actually the 3rd employee is here today. Raise your hand. Sarah Bergen was our intern, and she was 23 years old, just had graduated from Gustavus Adolphus. And then she became the executive of one of our most important colleague organizations, the Great Plains Institute. So now Jim said there's 30 employees, but there's actually 50 professional staff, including the contractors that we provide most of their income. We have a newspaper operation. We have 17 reporters in 17 states. So all these people work on public policy and storytelling. And everybody's working to shape and drive the change that's going to expand the opportunities and the markets for the climate solutions at scale. And we want to do it fairly and equitably so that everyone's going to benefit. So if there was a 6 formal scientific assessments of the problem that were published by an international body called the International Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC. And that's basically all the world scientists who agree on what the heck is going on with the climate. And they published it 6 times every few years since 1990, okay? Even when their very first report was issued in 1990, the plain physics of the matter was there for everybody to see. The plain physics of the matter. It was fully documented that all the oil majors, like Exxon, knew too, because their science was just as good as anybody else's. It's just physics. It's physics. So my own climate history, my personal climate history would begin in 1990, but I'm not a scientist, so it wasn't with the IPCC. It would begin with a political science professor from my alma mater, Carleton College. Paul Wellstone ran for the United States Senate. And Paul won the race, but one of his, people don't remember this, one of his top 3 issues that he ran on was renewable energy. Now, he wasn't running because of climate. He was a populist with an economic message, and he wanted to lift up rural voices who'd been left behind in the farm crisis. Remember from the 80s, the farm crisis, all these people lost their farms? So he was the person who inspired me to get involved and to form an advocacy group. And he inspired a whole generation of my peers to work for renewable energy. And our founders are actually the founding board of directors of our organization. They were Paul Wellstone's kitchen cabinet on energy. And people don't know this either, but we urged him on, we egged him on in his office to take on not only President George H.W. Bush, the oil man from Houston, but his own committee chair, who was an oil man from Louisiana in the Democratic Party. So Paul Wellstone took on both parties, and he organized a filibuster and stopped the drilling in the Alaska National Wildlife Refuge, taking on the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. He's pretty proud of that. And it was an environmental justice victory, a climate justice victory before there was even the word climate justice, because against all odds, Paul had stood with the native people, the indigenous people of Alaska, northern Alaska, the Gwich'in people. And he asked the question, if we knew a century ago or 2 centuries ago what we would have done to the indigenous peoples, would we really do it again today? He asked that question on the floor of the United States Senate. Pretty moving. Now, 1994, that little fledgling nonprofit advocacy group that I didn't even work for yet, I was just volunteering for, it later changed its indecipherable name to Fresh Energy. It was successful in jumpstarting both wind power and energy efficiency here in Minnesota. And Minnesota and Fresh Energy became national leaders on both of those issues. But I'm going to tell you this wrenching and personal and powerful story about how large-scale renewable energy came to Minnesota. It happened as part of a very bitter, terrible, brutal legislative fight over whether the nuclear power plants located in Red Wing, Minnesota, should be allowed to store nuclear waste outside of the plant, just 50 miles downriver from here. It was a necessary decision. It was to keep the power plants from closing down, but it also deepened a very grave injustice. The native communities, who had for thousands and thousands of years lived on lands that we call today Rice County and Goodhue County and Dakota County. Those native people have been pushed aside onto a small reservation alongside the Mississippi River. And that community is now the Prairie Island Indian community, home of the Midday Wahkiton Sioux. But that community shared experience is that when that Red Wing steam plant was originally proposed and built, they were never informed what the technology was. They were never informed what that was being built just 3 blocks from their daycare center and their community, just 3 blocks away. The tribe never granted its consent. So in 1994, over the strenuous objection of the tribe and all of Minnesota's environmental movement, the legislature approved the storage of nuclear waste outside the plant temporarily, on the condition that the federal government would get it out of there within 8 years. By 2002, it would be gone. Again, it was a necessary decision to keep the plant operational. But now it's 30 years later, there's no end in sight to nuclear waste stored at Prairie Island, immediately adjacent to the native community. And as objectionable as the whole history is, that Prairie Island nuclear waste decision by the 1994 Minnesota legislature was a landmark piece of legislation. It was a landmark law, and complicated, but because all the different issues get mashed up and pushed together at the legislature, that decision to keep the nuclear power plant running also resulted in the very first large-scale, industrial-scale wind farm in North America, outside of California, from the 70s, the wind turbines from the 70s of California. In fact, the very first wind farm built anywhere between California and Denmark. That first modern North American wind farm is still today out on Minnesota's Buffalo Ridge. It's a line of high elevation across the southwest corner of the state. And with so many things that change over time, today, most of the advocates for carbon-free power have reconsidered their opposition to nuclear power. It is, in fact, a firm source of energy, and it's very, very valuable when the winds aren't blowing and the sun's gone down. Very valuable. But another way that everything has changed, when Xcel now decides to seek permission from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission of the United States and seek permission from the Public Utilities Commission of the state of Minnesota to extend the life of that nuclear power plant beyond the end of its license in 2034, when they ask for permission, the single most important factor will be the consent of the Prairie Island Indian community. The single most important factor will be the consent of the Prairie Island Indian community. Do they give consent? And I am absolutely delighted and happy to say that the community and the company have worked together on their relationship for many, many years, and they reached an agreement on a life extension at Prairie Island nuclear reactors just 3 weeks ago. Just 3 weeks ago, there's an agreement between the Prairie Island Indian community and Xcel Energy to extend the life of that nuclear reactor. Isn't that cool? You thought there was a sad end to that story, right? At the federal level, in the 1990s, was a pretty big disappointment on climate. The President of the United States from 1992 to 2000, that was Bill Clinton. He defeated George H.W. Bush in his re-election bid, and Clinton selected as his vice president, United States Senator. He was from Tennessee. Remember? Al Gore. Now, already in 1990, Al Gore had established himself as a very diligent student on the climate science. And he showed his really deep expertise in a book that he wrote in 1989 called Earth in the Balance. And there's a chapter in Earth in the Balance. It's an environmentalist. There's a chapter in Earth in the Balance about climate. And I remember being so incredibly excited when Bill Clinton chose Al Gore, an environmental hero. I thought that meant that if there's an environmental hero in the White House, that we're ready to act on climate. Oh, how naive I was. Plain physics, the absolute scientific reality, the need for urgent action, that was all laid out black and white in his book. It's all laid out. And this was 17 years before that famous movie that Al Gore made back in 2006, An Inconvenient Truth. And that movie made Al Gore's name synonymous with the message that we have to act on climate. Now, I have it seared in my memory all these many years that in that book, Al Gore prophetically said, I always remember this quote, that solving the climate crisis was going to be the central organizing principle of human civilization. He wrote that in 1989, that solving the climate crisis was going to be the central organizing principle of human civilization. So imagine my disappointment when they didn't get anything done. They produced no progress on climate action in 2 whole terms. No progress. And then, when he ran for president himself, he didn't run on the need for climate action. People think, remember, he lost by 537 votes when the Supreme Court stopped the vote. You know how many votes Ralph Nader got in Florida? 90,000 votes. Al Gore only needed 1% of Ralph Nader's votes to become president because he didn't run on climate. Politically wasn't wise, they were telling him. So I tell this story not to disparage Al Gore. Al Gore is my generation's greatest climate advocate. I'm not disparaging him. He's a hero of mine. This video, Google YouTube video, I mean, he's still on fire. He's good on this subject. But his political failures, his policy failures, it's just the first chapter in a long, sad, bipartisan history at the federal level from 1988 to 2020. It's long, sad history. Give you the short version of history. So compounding the inaction of 16 years of Democratic presidents who did nothing on climate and 16 years of Republican presidents who did nothing on climate, that's 32 years total. The issue then became partisan, wildly partisan. So how do you solve a big problem as this when one of the 2 major political parties gives it no legitimacy? How do we deal with this? That's where we are today. The reason that it shifted to become so partisan, it's very well documented in a book by Jane Meyer, a fabulous, great book, landmark book called Dark Money. People know that book, Dark Money? It's a big book. It's just a chapter on energy. Dark Money, the hidden history of billionaires behind the rise of the radical right. The hidden history of billionaires behind the rise of the radical right. Meyer lays out a very well-financed disinformation campaign on climate, and it was led by the oil industry. Special mention has to go again to ExxonMobil and Koch Industries, a privately held corporation with annual revenues as high as $110 billion a year. And their very largest asset sells you gasoline. The refinery in Rosemont is where your gasoline comes from the Koch Industries. That's their biggest asset. We're financing disinformation on climate when we buy gas. We're financing it. So now it's 2008, the presidential campaign was on, and guess what? There was almost no difference in the climate positions between the two major political parties. There was almost no difference. So it never got debated. The Republican president candidate was John McCain, and he was arguably America's foremost climate leader in public office, although admittedly he had never passed any of the bipartisan legislation that bore his name. 3 different bills, none of them ever became law. But he was the leading voice in America on climate, John McCain was. And then there was a freshman senator from the south side of Chicago, that skinny guy, remember that guy? He more or less agreed with everything John McCain thought on climate, so they never debated it. However, for those of us who are watching very closely, Senator McCain squandered away his climate cred when he selected Sarah Palin of Alaska to be his vice president. On her very first weekend on the national stage, I remember her on the Sunday morning talk shows winking at the television camera that she was going to work on Senator McCain's position against Alaska National Wildlife Drilling. She was going to work on that. Like when you're the vice presidential candidate, you don't have positions that differ from the guy running for office. You have the same position, right? So McCain could have selected governor of Minnesota. Tim Pawlenty could have been, and he was just coming off a year of sweeping clean energy victories in 2007. Because that was the year that we say fresh energy ran the table. All of our bills became laws. I guess until this year, that was our best legislative year ever, until this year. So what became law? The legislature set a requirement that every utility sells electricity in the state have 25% of it from wind and solar. The legislature ramped up all the expectations and the requirements for all the electric companies to do energy efficiency better. We banned the construction of new coal-fired power plants. It was against the law. We set science-based climate goals in state law of how we reduce carbon over time. And that year, after that year, Minnesota was one of the top 3 or 4 states in America on energy policy and climate action, just how it had been in 1994 when we got the wind industry started and we kept the nuclear reactor open. And I still remember all the thrill of like political endgame negotiations, like being in the room, with the Hamilton line in the room, right? I still remember all the negotiations with the utility lobbyists. And our team knew, all the environmental advocates, we knew that every 1% renewable energy we got would be about $200 million worth of wind turbines over a decade. So 25%, every 1% was $200 million worth of wind turbines. But those 2007 laws, they were all passed with very broad bipartisan support. We had 193 votes out of 201 members of the legislature. I don't think we got Michelle Bachmann, but we got most everybody else. We got most everybody else. But we didn't actually get Tom Emmer either. I might have history record. But we had 193 votes out of 201. And so even though the powerhouse Democratic Speaker of the House, Margaret Anderson Kelleher, helped drive those bills to the end game and drive them to the desk of the governor, it was Republican Governor Tim Pawlenty who signed all the bills into law. He's like a drum major jumping to the front of the marching band. But he gets the credit because he's the governor of the states. He signed the bills. He gets most visibility. He gets the credit. So he was a climate hero. And I'm going to tell you an insider thing, a little insider thing. So in those very exciting negotiations, we're essentially negotiating with the industry. And I was advising the inner circle of the legislators who were writing the laws, but I was talking regularly with the inner circle of the people who were advising Governor Pawlenty. And years later, I don't think Governor Pawlenty would mind me saying this, years later, I learned that he knew he was out in front in America on climate change. He knew that. And he relished that role. He liked it. When 6 or 8 of his key people were debating in a room, like, could we do this? Could we do that? Could we support this? Could we sign that? Pawlenty was, and I'm quoting here, he was the greenest guy in the room. That's what his advisors told me. But the following summer, with all the various possibilities that were being mentioned and ruled out, who's going to be the vice presidential candidate under John McCain, the news anchor, I remember one day, the news anchor said, all eyes are on Minnesota Governor Tim Pawlenty. Well, he was sort of an obvious shortlist choice because he was a 2-time Republican governor in a historically blue swing Midwestern state. Midwest matters in national politics. But then all of a sudden, Senator McCain picks Sarah Palin. So it's just a few days later that the Republican National Convention that year was held in St. Paul at the Xcel Energy Center. I rented out my house to some solar executives and went on vacation. Went on vacation. And Tim Pawlenty was in the back of the auditorium, in the back of the Xcel Energy Center. And on the podium was Governor Palin. And the most famous moment of that convention was her leading all the delegates in a chant. Drill, baby, drill. Drill, baby, drill. Drill, baby, drill. Republican politics had taken a pretty dark turn on climate change and on everything else. But Governor Pawlenty did, in fact, abandon this hard-won climate cred when he ran for president in 2012 because he wasn't going to let the Sarah Palin wing of the Republican Party get the best of him again. We backed away from all those accomplishments. So over the very first term of the Obama presidency, the climate then became deeply, deeply partisan. And it's only gotten worse since then. By 2012, that's when the second term began, is in 2012. The climate denial and the fossil fuel industry spending, it had gone on for years and years and years, and it was finally starting to grip and take. You know, global warming, no one really knows what's going on. Who really knows? Scientists are debating, they're confused, they don't really know, nobody knows. The product was doubt. They were merchants of doubt. They were selling confusion and obfuscation. And they had allies like the Wall Street Journal editorial page to reach the elites. And they had Fox News to reach Main Street. And so Americans were like, who knows what's going on with climate? It's very confusing. Nobody really knows. And the takeover of one of America's major political parties was complete. The Republican parties, you couldn't run for office if you cared about climate the way John McCain and Tim Pawlenty did. You could not run for office by 2012. Got it? Complete takeover of the party by the oil industry. Got it? It's a fact. It's not an opinion. It's not advocacy. It's a fact. So historians would say that this climate partisanship was just one aspect of this rightward surge that responded to the Obama presidency in general. You know, the right surge. You know, remember the Tea Party and all that happened after the healthcare bill and all that. So he was completely unable, Obama was completely unable to advance his climate agenda. And in 2009, it burned a fiery death on the floor of the United States Senate. It actually never came up for a vote. And it was you remember this? The cap and trade program? Oh, spare me. A declining cap on pollution, a market for selling pollution credits. And I fault the American environmental movement much, much more than I fault Barack Obama. I fault myself and, more importantly, the national leadership. And I'll name names. I'll name the actual name who I fault. Fred Krupp of the Environmental Defense Fund. He worked on that product for 20 years. And when he rolled out the product, he set back the industry 20 years. Why does he still have that job? Now, I've never said that in public before. That's an editorial that I just ad-libbed in my speech, by the way. And maybe he'll see it and call me up. I don't know. To his credit, Barack Obama did actually a much better job moving forward on climate action with his stimulus recovery bill. Because in the stimulus recovery bill, after the world's economy had basically virtually collapsed, that was the brightest spot in this whole 32-year history on climate change. Because in the stimulus recovery bill, there were so many strategic investments in energy innovation, so many interesting things that got these industries moving. These industries that weren't really ready for prime time got moving because of that bill. And for example, it was one of the most important puzzle pieces in the birth of the electric car industry worldwide. Is the Obama stimulus bill was one of the most important puzzle pieces in the electric car industry. And there's a whole fantastic book about it. If you love reading books, this is a great book, easy to read, fun to read. Mike Grunwald, The New Deal, The Hidden Story of Change in the Obama Era. It's about the stimulus bill driving innovation in energy is the subject of that book. So now we're going to fast forward from 2012, if you're following along, 2012, that was the first year of Obama's second term. We're going to go right up to the midterm election in 2018, and then we're going to talk about the presidential election in 2020. So I know I just skipped over like 6 or 8 years, but trust me, there was just climate paralysis, and there was that other guy who got elected. You remember that guy? And there was just steady progress in the states. The states were making progress. And again, credit where credit is due. Many organizations like Fresh Energy all over America were just plugging away. We're passing bills, we're closing coal plants, we're building wind farms, but the federal government is AWOL, okay? And I'm not telling you this exasperating story because it's my life. I am telling you this story because state action, policy action at the local level, it was the only way to make any progress, because no progress could be made at the federal government. But the most important fact of this long, sad, terrible federal climate history is that now it's been wonderfully swept away and it's gone. It's gone. That's all gone. And so this is the pivot point in the talk, like where I go from the sad part to the happy part, where now decades of federal paralysis are going to fade. And those of us with privilege and status and wealth and accomplishments and titles in my generation who had completely failed on climate nationally, in the national policy, including all the leadership of all the environmental groups, not just environmental defense, but all the leadership of all the national environmental groups, we all have to admit that we failed on national public policy. We failed our own children. We failed their children. But the good news of the story is that our children did not fail. The children changed history, and that's the rest of the story. So now a whole new future is coming into view. And the next 4 years of progress is again going to be more than the previous 40 years combined. And Al Gore had said it prophetically in 1989, but now it's true. We're about to make climate action and climate justice the central organizing principle in human civilization. We're about to actually do that actual thing now. And it's a dramatic moment right now of change. And we're living in this moment. It's very hard to see how dramatic it is, what an incredible inflection point it is, and how we even got here. How do we get here? But on climate and energy, everything going forward is different than everything past. Fresh Energy is going to be part of that. Everything going forward is going to be different than everything past. Here's how it actually happened. Here's how it happened. So remember the 2018 midterm elections? Midterm elections almost always do the same thing, is they swing the politics hard against the incumbent president. That's what almost always happens. Didn't happen one time, but it almost always happens. In 2018, the climate warrior Nancy Pelosi, she won back her House of Representatives with her Democrats, but then she had to struggle inside her caucus to get the speakership back. Now, most people think that she had troubles on the conservative side of her caucus because they were tired of the liberal icon from San Francisco, and they're like, maybe we get somebody else a chance. But she actually had more problems on the progressive side. And no one was more problematic than the climate activists. They were a problem. Because diverse, inclusive groups of youth climate activists had been organizing in high schools and in colleges everywhere in America and everywhere in the world with justice as their message, and they were fed up. They were really fed up. The impatience of the young people had boiled over. In Sweden, in August of that year, a 15-year-old refused to go to school on Friday. Just sat out in the front of the school. Why go to school? What's the point? Greta Thunberg came onto the world stage. International protest movement, Fridays for the Future. And the American climate movement, it dramatically shifted away from the national establishment, environmental groups, with its aging leaders, both white, male, like me. And there was a new movement coming up, a movement led by young people and BIPOC leaders, a different voice, a different seeming movement, completely different. And on the very first day of Congress in 2019, the new Democratic Congress is coming to work on the first day. People might not remember this, but maybe you do. There was a youth climate movement, an upstart group called the Sunrise Movement. People know the Sunrise Movement? They did something that was so shocking to mainstream environmental groups and to Washington insiders and to everybody in general. Frankly, I'd never even heard of the Sunrise Movement until just a few months earlier, before they made headlines. You see, they decided to stage a protest in Nancy Pelosi's office. Really? And among the names who took the stage was a young BIPOC woman, Varshini Prakash, and she led the movement in that action. And then they were joined by a 29-year-old freshman congresswoman, also a woman of color, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who had just defeated her establishment opponent by 15 points in the primary in the Bronx. Like, would you do that on your first day job in Congress? Take over the speaker's office? But Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had run for Congress on the theme that we need a total mobilization in America, total mobilization, like World War II, a total mobilization of all our resources to address climate. Like we had to respond to the Great Depression, totally mobilize everybody. It was a Green New Deal. And of course, I was in favor of a total mobilization. I was in favor of that. But I was not in favor of a mobilization in Nancy Pelosi's office to take over the speaker's office. That would not have been my cup of tea. But the American politics was remade by the kids aggressively pushing their Green New Deal. And now I admit, looking back at history, I was wrong. My pragmatic approach wasn't right for that moment in history. In the bruising 2020 presidential primaries, everybody wanted to be president on the Democratic side. Every single Democratic candidate came out with some version of their own of their Green New Deal, every single one of them, including our own Amy Klobuchar, which I think was hard for her because it was the Green New Deal was a phrase she did not actually want to say publicly very often. You know, she's trying to get more in the middle and didn't want to say that. So when Joe Biden emerged as a nominee for the Democrats, many people on the left mistakenly assumed that he was a cautious centrist Democratic politician. But really what he is cautious to be is at the very center of the Democratic Party. That's what he's cautious about. And the kids had moved the climate issue to the center of the action. So he was nominated, and then he convened a climate and energy work group, like, well, okay, I got to get my platform together on climate and energy. He had to hammer out an agenda that was his, and he was not going to call it the Green New Deal, definitely was not going to call it that. But what emerged, and the reason why Green New Deal got so beat up is people who watch Fox News heard about the Green New Deal all day, every day for 90 days. And the rest of us hardly ever heard about it ever. So the Green New Deal was defined by Fox News, not by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And that's why he couldn't run on that term, Green New Deal. But he put together a committee that was co-chaired by an old hand climate warrior, somebody you all admire, John Kerry, old hand climate warrior, a trusted climate hawk, mainstream trusted climate hawk. He's the president's envoy to the United Nations on climate change right now. But the other co-chair was Bernie Sanders, representing the full spectrum, the full ideological range of the whole Democratic Party. And what do you know? At the table, one of the people, Varshini Prakash. Oh my God. Take over the speaker's office, and 2 years later, you're forming Joe Biden's policy agenda. That's a pretty good play. But because of the youth movement, the whole Democratic electorate had shifted their views on climate change. And so Joe Biden ran, and he won on a sweeping climate platform. I hope everybody agrees he won. Just a little, that was supposed to be funny. So Joe Biden ran and won on a sweeping climate platform, and it was finally aligned with the need for the speed and the scale and the massive investments that's required for the actual physical reality of the situation and the climate crisis. He actually ran on the platform that Al Gore wouldn't even mention in 2000. And by election day, I think, and I was watching pretty damn closely, I think that climate was arguably the very, very top issue in the election, the last 8 or 9 days of the election. I think climate was the top issue. And the new president immediately re-engaged with all the nations of the world. And even though it's a very flawed international process where all the individual countries get together every couple of years and they make promises to each other, Joe Biden went back to the international agreement and he pledged that like all other 192 nations, our emissions, America's emissions would be zero by about 2050. Zero, net zero. And I'm not going to explain why you use the word net, but it'd be zero by 2050. But he added a little wrinkle. We would get halfway there this decade. Whoa. I reacted like, that's going to be hard, but it's the right answer. That's just 6 years and 36 weeks away. We're going to cut our emissions by half. And we're going to rely on standards and investment and justice. And all the space that had been taken up by this fierce youth movement fighting for a Green New Deal, all that political space now taken up by the agreement. We're going to get it to zero, but we're going to get it halfway there this decade. It's the Green New Deal with a new name. It's just a new name. So shocking everyone, after many months of negotiations, the climate deal was announced by Senator Schumer and Senator Manchin on July 27. And it was signed into law 2 weeks later. The deal was announced. Tina Smith tweeted, "Holy shit," reflecting pretty much how I felt about it. The bill was absurdly named the Inflation Reduction Act for political reasons, but amazingly, it gets us 80% of the way to cut emissions by half this decade. Amazingly, it became law. It gets us 80% of the way there. The partisan divide couldn't have been any more obvious. Not a single moderate Republican legislator voted for it. But the coal baron, coal senator from the coal state, Joe Manchin, had his name on the bill. He had his name on the bill. How amazing is that? That no moderate Republican in a suburban district anywhere in America could vote for it, but the coal baron had his name on the bill. That's how partisan it got. So it's significant what the Kochs have accomplished taking over one of the political parties. That's what that is. Okay? So, but what the Democrats alone in Congress delivered to the president is not just our energy policy or climate policy, it's our industrial policy, our labor policy, our manufacturing policy, our trade policy, our equity and justice policy, And it's our national security policy, because none of this materials for wind and solar and cars can be purchased from China and Russia. It's a national security policy. So I think it'll be so popular, it'll never be repealed, even if the politics shift back to the hard right. So now going forward, everything in my life is completely different. Everything going forward is different from my whole climate life, because now the most prosperous nation in the world, who's dumped the most pollution in the sky, we have a plan to cut emissions within half, about 6 years. So the plan is very straightforward. We're going to get all the carbon out of the electricity supply. We're going to electrify everything we can. And we now have 10 years worth of incentives that's going to drive the cost down for all the solutions. We can still tackle the really tricky, hard problems like shipping and air travel and cement and steel, all chemicals and fertilizer. But this year, the Minnesota legislature got in the action, and Governor Walz's signature climate and energy policy became law, that all of Minnesota's electricity will be carbon-free in 17 years, 100% carbon-free in 17 years. The bill was very well understood when the legislature started, and the two authors worked together hand in hand, and they had it on the governor's desk in 3 weeks. So the last thing to point out is that in the Minnesota Senate, there are 34 Democrats and 33 Republicans. It's completely closely divided. But I'm going to say something about the youth, is that there was very, very, very high voter turnout in legislative districts like St. Cloud and Mankato and Moorhead, which are college towns. Extremely high turnout among college voters. So the Minnesota Senate knew they had a majority because youth climate organizers and action, they had to act on climate because that's why they were in power. Amazing, amazing. So the law is fabulous. We're in a world now where all serious and well-informed people know we're going to zero. 192 nations agreed on it. Now the richest nation in the world has a plan. We have to deploy these technologies. We have to invent a few to fill in the gaps. We have to just electrify everything we can. We have to get all the carbon out of electricity supply. And just to show you how this is already working, since the passage of the act in August to the end of the year, there was $32 billion in new factories investments. $32 billion were announced in batteries, in battery material processing, and car manufacture. And since January 1, there's been another $32 billion announced in new investments in America in manufacturing. Can you believe that? $65 billion have been announced in investments in batteries, in battery materials processing, and in car manufacture in America. That kind of level of investment, even one project like that would happen every 2 to 5 years, and now they're happening every week. That's the bill is working. So closing, I would like to say that even though there's the most narrow pathway possible to keep the warming from going over the edge, we might not make it that the world doesn't warm up more than 1.5 degrees, but we should fight so it doesn't warm up more than 2. And the good news is that I think it's off the table that it's going to warm up 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 or 8, which is all the things I've been thinking about for 30 years, a world that warms up 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 or 8. That's not going to happen. That's not going to happen. The worst thing is off the table. And it is very tragically unjust that the most suffering, this is my last paragraph. It's just, I get the cue. It's most tragic and unjust that the people of the world who's contributed the least to this problem suffer the most. This is so tragically unjust. The people of Holland know how to build higher dikes, but 15 to 20% of Bangladesh has an elevation less than 1 meter above sea level. And what will your life will be when all of your streams and watersheds are inundated with salt water? What will your life be? The most suffering goes to the people who contributed the least. And my generation has handed over a mess to our children Even though so many of us work so hard to prevent this, I know we made a difference. We set the stage. But now the very most hopeful thing in my life is young people. I'm optimistic about technology. I'm optimistic about more policy and the financial tools. We got to keep our focus that this transformation lifts up those who got left behind, that the Inflation Reduction Act's clear commitments to justice and inclusion, those are upheld. But when we pair all of that with the ingenuity and the innovation of this next generation, I feel very, very strongly that our young people are going to take us where we need to go. Thank you.
What a wow. Thank you so much, Michael. Wow. I hope you're going to stay involved in all of this. Yeah, I hope. Can you hang around for a few minutes?
Oh, as long as you like.
Okay, so he will take questions. He will hang around here. So I have to call it off. Jim, did you want to
Do a question before I go. Can I do a question?
hurry up?
This had to defend my pal Al Gore. I was covering all of this for the Star Tribune. And when Gore and Clinton were first elected, they proposed a 30% BTU tax. And it was hammered down to a 5-cent gas tax. But they tried, but it was just hopeless. Any event, Mike, that was fantastic.
Yeah, it's just wonderful.
Thank you, Jim.
So I need to tell you, next week, April 30th, again at 10 a.m., Mark Mueller will be here to speak on regenerative agriculture. He's with the Regenerative Agriculture Foundation. So kind of continuing our climate concerns. And he talks about building regenerative landscapes. So I think that'll be another excellent one to come. But thanks again, Michael. It was just marvelous, really. Yeah. Thank you, everybody. Yeah.
So people can leave right now if they want, but if anybody wants to stay around after people leave, we'll just take 1 or 2 questions.